Okay, well, this is video number 4, I think it is, in our series on Exodus. And in today's videos, I want to talk about just a few things from Exodus chapter 5, verse 1, through chapter 12 and verse 36. That's a rather lengthy passage, I know. And there's so much here we could talk about, but I know you'd like for me to keep these videos as short as possible, so I will. There are just a few things I want to highlight. First of all, let's talk about the plagues in general. All of the plagues are an attack on the gods of Egypt, aren't they? For example, the Nile was regarded as sacred by the Egyptians. So what does God do? He turns the Nile into blood. The last plague, the worst plague, Pharaoh himself was seen as a god in Egypt, so his firstborn dies, and Pharaoh is powerless to do anything about it. All of the plagues, in one way or another, are an attack upon Egypt's gods, a particular god, the Nile, cattle, and so forth. Now, what we have seen in our reading of the plagues is that they are an opportunity to defeat Egypt's gods. And they show us that God is mighty, and yes, that God is bigger than the gods of Egypt, and he will unleash the forces of creation to drive this point home. And in the end, Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt are no match for the God of Israel, right? But we might also say that God is witnessing in these plagues. He's not just defeating the gods of Egypt. He's witnessing to the nations, Egypt included, that in these plagues he is the God of the universe. They are all the plagues are calculated to move Pharaoh and his subjects from rebellion to belief in the God of the Hebrews. So God is witnessing in these plagues as well. He's telling the world who he is. He's telling the world something of his power. But also, we could say that the plagues are God's way of vindicating Israel and punishing Egypt for the way they had treated his children. The last plague, the death of the firstborn, is clearly retribution for Pharaoh's attempt to kill the male children of Israel in chapter 1. For Pharaoh's decree to kill those male children was ultimately not against Israel's children, right? But against God's children. I think that's important to see. You don't mess with God's children. God's going to punish those who mess with his children. And one thing we can learn from the plagues is that surely there is no one like our God. He is powerful, but we also learn that God will take care of his kids. And we can depend on him to defend us. And we don't have to be in the payback business. We can leave that in God's hands. Now, before I talk about Moses' development as a leader, and that's what I want to talk about, I want to briefly talk about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Stephanie brought this up in our online community. Way to go, Stephanie. And I'm sure all of us have raised this question as we read through this text. How can it be said that Pharaoh hardened his own heart? It says that many times. And that God hardened his heart. It says that many times. Well, they both were responsible for the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, right? That's what the text says. Pharaoh was stubborn. He would not let the people go. He hardened his own heart, but God also played a role in the hardening of that heart. You know, the fact of the matter is that God had a plan. His plan was not just to redeem Israel from Egyptian bondage, but his plan was to show Egypt and the world his power, and that there was no God in the world like the God of the Hebrews. And frankly, in God's hands, Pharaoh was a rag doll. Pharaoh was just a piece on the chessboard. God is sovereign. God is in control. God's plan will be carried out. And so Pharaoh did have a choice in the hardening of his heart, but he didn't have a choice because God was going to use Pharaoh's hard heart to prove who he was. Now, the problem this raises for us is, how can God be responsible for hardening Pharaoh's heart if Pharaoh has the freedom of choice, the freedom of will, to choose to let the people go or not to let them go. You see the dilemma here. And I think, first of all, we ought to say that we have to allow these two truths to remain in tension with each other, even if we don't understand how they can work together. Pharaoh is responsible for the hardening of his own heart. He had a choice to make, and he made the wrong choice. Human free will is something that is real. God does not overrule freedom of will. But on the other hand, God has a plan, and he had a plan, and he's going to work out his plan, and he's going to have his way. And Pharaoh was the ragdoll in that plan. We must hold those two truths, the sovereignty of God and human free will, in tension. We don't have to give up on either one of those truths, even if we don't understand how they work out. I know that's not a perfectly satisfying explanation of what's going on in the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, but that's the best I can do right now. Now, let's talk about Moses and his development as a leader. I want you to note in chapter 5, verse 21, how he is treated. Israel comes to him, and when their burdens are increased, they strike out against Moses, their leader. You know, it's one thing to receive opposition from the enemy, but to be rebuffed by the very friends you are trying to deliver, that's sad, isn't it? But it's true, and it happens every day. Leaders will be opposed and rejected by their own followers. Lesson here: we can expect rejection from those that we are trying to influence and trying to lead. But I want you to notice how Moses responds to that. He blames God. There's a whole lot of blaming others going on here, right? The people blame Moses because they are forced to make bricks without straw, and then Moses blames God. For example, notice chapter 5, verses 21, 22. Lord, why have you mistreated this people? Why did you ever send me? Since I first came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has mistreated this people, and you have done nothing at all to deliver your people. Wow. Why, Lord? Is what Moses says. In his estimation, the Lord is moving way too slowly. There's a lesson there for us, right? We don't always see God's timetable, and we don't often accept his timetable as we should. Well, what we see here is that Moses is not yet the stalwart leader that he becomes. He has much more to learn about God, for here he calls God's character into question. Moses is still developing as a leader, and what I like is that God is patient with him as he develops, as he is with us. And then Moses has another attack of a lack of self-confidence and despondency in chapter 6, verses 9 through 13. And if you look at that passage, you hear once again Moses say, I can't speak. I can't talk straight. I mean, if Israel won't even listen to me, how is Pharaoh going to listen to me? And we remember here that God had provided Aaron to be Moses' spokesperson, and he reminds him again, Aaron will be by your side, and I will be by your side. But you may have noticed that before long, as you read through this text, Aaron is speaking for Moses, but before long, Moses is speaking for himself. His confidence is growing. He apparently loses his shyness, and I think beginning in chapter 9, Moses is the one who stretches out his staff and his hand over Egypt to plague Egypt, and he no longer needs a spokesman. It's as if God is like a father who says to Moses, okay, I'll have Aaron help you, but like a father who knows his own son's abilities better than the son may know them himself, God nudges Moses into the very situation that he fears most, and then he grows this leader of his in the process. Of course, for us, one of the takeaways may be that God has called us to certain tasks, and he will equip us to carry out those tasks. And we must trust that God knows what he is doing. He will develop us. So, be encouraged, Christian leader. Fulfill your calling. God will help you. Now, I'd like to talk about the Passover, but I think we better save that for the next video. Meantime, If you have any comments or questions, unless your name is Stephanie, I'm teasing, that you want to share, any comments or questions that you want to share with me or the group, please do so. Post in this room or send me an email, and together we'll try to address it. And I'm so glad you are part of this community with us as we study through this great book, the book of Exodus. God bless you.